Okay, well, we're going to begin every class by reminding ourselves of the class outline. And this is just a good, handy roadmap for what we're covering, what we're going to cover, and where we're going this semester with the various topics. As I thought more about last week and our discussion of the different approaches to apologetics, I think I called them different methods. You might remember the traditional or the classical method, the evidentialist method, and then the presuppositional approach to apologetics. The more I thought about that, it made me think that possibly one thing that distinguishes between those three groups is, as I mentioned last week, where they put their emphasis, but I think probably a better way to say it is the reason that each of those groups puts their emphasis where they do is that's where they find that the evidence is the strongest. In other words, for a traditional or a classical apologist like myself, of these three things that we're looking at, the existence of God, whether Jesus is God or not, and then whether the Bible is from God or not, traditional classical apologists are most confident about the first one, about the existence of God. Now, they believe in those other two things, obviously, but they feel that the evidence or the arguments are the strongest for the existence of God. So that might be why they put the emphasis there in their approach. An evidentialist, and the first one that comes to mind for me is somebody like Gary Habermas. He is overwhelmed. He finds the evidence, for example, for Jesus' resurrection to be very compelling. And so for him, I took a class with him, and I've heard him say that for him, he could even make, and he has, an argument for the existence of God from evidence of Jesus' resurrection. And that to me seems completely backwards. But he just finds, and this is what he studied the most in his career, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. He just finds that to be the most compelling argument of all of these things, and so that's where he puts his emphasis, and a lot of other evidentialists do as well. Now, of course, he believes in the existence of God. He believes the Bible is from God, but he finds the evidence, the arguments, the reasons to believe that Jesus really is God the strongest argument. So maybe that's why they put the emphasis there. And then possibly, at least for some presuppositionalists, they're most confident about the third part of this, that the Bible is from God. And that might drive some of why they emphasize some of the things that they do. I don't want to speak for them, but it just dawned on me that that might be, why these different groups have different approaches, because they find these three different things more compelling than others. So for example, like I said, I find the first part, the evidence for the existence of God, just completely overwhelming. I think the evidence that Jesus is God is good, but not as good as evidence for the existence of God. And then, for me at least, third, the evidence that the Bible is from God, good evidence, but not as much evidence as the first two things, that God exists and that Jesus is God. Not only do I think that is the case, but also as a traditional, as a classical apologist, I think there is good reasons to make a case for Christianity in this order, as we talked about last week. But that was just a follow-up I wanted to touch base on. So let's zoom in. We're in the first part here, presenting arguments and evidence that there is a supreme being. So we'll zoom in, and as you can see, there are a lot of arguments for the existence of God, but as you can see, we're just going to focus on three. And these are the big three. The argument for God from first cause, the argument for God from design, and then the argument for God from morality. Those are the three we're going to focus on, and then also deal with some objections to the existence of God. So tonight we're going to cover the first cause argument for God. And again, I'm using God in a very generic term at this point, as a very generic term. Just as in the English language, it's a generic term used for supreme being. So I'm making a case that there is a supreme being out there beyond the universe. So let me set up this argument a bit. It's actually a family of arguments. We're going to look at a specific one tonight. But first cause arguments, there are many of them, and they've been around for a long time. In fact, there's a sense in which you can find first cause arguments in many different cultures throughout human history. A lot of cultures, in fact, I would say the majority of cultures, have tended toward theism, and even a polytheistic culture would usually have a main god. You know, they believed in many gods, but they would have a main one, or an ultimate one, or a supreme deity. So you can find this argument, or this type of argument, all throughout history among various cultures and people groups. Sometimes it's referred to as a cosmological argument. And again, it's really a family of arguments because there are many, but they're similar. And so they're called cosmological arguments or first cause arguments. So I'll just give you an example of one from history, and that is from Aristotle. Aristotle had a first cause type of argument that he promoted. It's famously known as Aristotle's unmoved mover. And it goes like this. It sounds really simple at first, but it's actually fairly sophisticated, but it goes like this. First of all, is there something moving? And I think we can look around and see, yes, there is movement. We see that things are in motion. Even ourselves, there's motion going on in our own bodies. The next question then, as Aristotle put it forth, he said, is this thing that's being moved, is it moved by something else? And yeah, that's what we see. We see that everything that is moving seems to have been moved by something else. Even within my own body, I'm the one who is causing the motion. And if you look back, you know, where did my motion come from? Well, you can think my parents, right? How did I come into motion, so to speak, from my parents, and so on and so forth. The next aspect of this is he would ask, well, can this chain of movement be infinite? And the answer is no. Most philosophers, most thinkers would say there can't be an actual infinite. We want to avoid an infinite regress. There's got to be some stopping point. And you can make philosophical arguments for this point, and we won't take the time to do that tonight, but Aristotle did, and most thinkers would agree there can't be an infinite regress. There has to be some stop. For example, just a very simple example, if you are driving and you come across a train stop and you see a train going by, car after car after car, well, what do you know for sure? Well, you know there's got to be an end to it. There's got to be, in other words, an engine that is either pushing the cars or pulling the cars. There's got to be an end to the train. It can't be an infinite amount of cars, right? There's got to be some stopping point that's causing the initial motion. Similarly, according to Aristotle, he argued that there has to be an unmoved mover at the head of the chain of motion. Now, as I said, this seems rather simple, but it's actually fairly sophisticated once you get into it and study Aristotle's argument. He argued that this prime mover, this unmoved mover, doesn't start movement with a push, like you think of some, silly Greek mythology god that's like starts motion by giving everything a big push. No, Aristotle argued that this supreme being, this unmoved mover, as he described it, gets things moving more with a pull. That movement is the result of everything being drawn to its final purpose. And in fact, this unmoved mover, this prime mover, is the ultimate purpose of all things. All things that exist, that are in motion, have as their ultimate purpose this prime mover. And it's through thought and love that he is moving things, but more of a pull towards him. Their telos, their purpose, is found in him. So it's rather sophisticated and very beautiful. He also argued that this prime mover is a necessary being, an eternal being, and an unchanging being. So it's interesting how he draws these inferences, just looking at his creation, looking at the world, the universe, and then drawing these implications from what he sees, and, through reason and philosophy. So that's just one example from history of this first cause argument, cosmological arguments. But we're going to look at a very specific one, a different one tonight. And let me just give it to you in a nutshell. What I try to do when I go through these arguments is just lay out right at the beginning the basic argument. And then we'll go through and I'll try to defend each premise and show how it leads to the conclusion. So here's the first cause argument, the cosmological argument that we're going to focus on tonight. Premise 1, whatever has a beginning has a cause. Premise 2, the universe had a beginning. Therefore, conclusion, the universe had a cause. Now, the reason I want to focus on this one is it's very exciting. Over the last 100 years, this argument has been strengthened by numerous scientific discoveries. So this argument has become more powerful, more compelling over the last 100 years as our scientists have discovered certain things, and we'll walk through that history, that story of scientific discovery during the 1900s. Now, I first learned about these discoveries when I was an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska. I was a business major, but I took Astronomy 101 as one of my electives, and that's when I first discovered or first learned about these scientific discoveries. I took astronomy at the University of Nebraska with this professor, Dr. Martin Gaskell. He's not at Nebraska anymore. Now he teaches at the University of California. But even when he was at Nebraska, this was mid-90s, he was very high up in his field. He sat on the committee of the Hubble Space Telescope, which determined, where the Hubble Space Telescope was going to be pointed. So very high up in his profession. He is rather well known for this incident. He's an evangelical Christian, by the way. It was neat because as a professor, sometimes he would read prayers in the classroom of some of the early astronomers and how they were just amazed as they were discovering, as they said it, God's thoughts. They were thinking God's thoughts after him as they studied God's creation. So evangelical Christian, I'll never forget the first day of class. There were like 200 students there in the classroom. Most of us weren't science majors, but we were taking it as an elective. And he went on and talked about, like all professors do on the first day of class, their background, why they're interested in their subject. And then he says, it blew my mind. He said, of all the things I've studied in the universe as an astronomer, the most important thing I've found so far is Jesus Christ. So it just blew my mind that he would say that and be so open about his faith at a public university. But he's rather well known. When he was looking for another professor role, he applied at the University of Kentucky after he left Nebraska and ended up not getting the position, but come to find out there were emails sent around the faculty or maybe the university administration who was in charge of the hiring process, that the reason they didn't hire him was because of his religious faith, his Christian faith. So he sued and ended up winning over that. But now he is serving as a professor at the University of California. I say all that to say this, I'm not a scientist, and so sometimes this science can go over my head. I find this argument to be very compelling, and I do my best to try to understand the science, but I'll be the first to admit I'm not a professional scientist, And so I have to rely on scientists like Dr. Martin Gaskell to help me understand these things. Another resource that I would recommend to you is by this gentleman, Dr. Stephen Barr. He earned his PhD in physics from Princeton, went on to do high-level research in theoretical particle physics and cosmology, studying astronomy of the universe. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society and now is a professor of theoretical particle physics at the University of Delaware. And this book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, has been just a real blessing in my life to help me understand these scientific discoveries. And he is a professional academic scientist, obviously. And so I think he provides that credibility. I'm not making an argument from authority here. Just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. But considering his background, his research, his studies, his degrees, it provides a bit of scientific credibility when he makes these arguments. And so I'm getting a lot of my material tonight from him and this book, which I would recommend. It's the same thing as we'll look at all throughout this semester. It's impossible to memorize all these details, so knowing and having these good resources is important. And this is one that I would encourage you to have on your bookshelf. Okay, let's get to the argument then. Premise 1. Whatever has a beginning must have a cause. Now, we're not going to spend much time on this premise because it's so well established. Most everybody will grant this premise. Really, it's the law of causality, right? The law of cause and effect. Everything needs a cause. Everything that has a beginning needs a cause. So think about it just for a moment. I mean, if something's always been around, it's kind of easy to take it for granted and not question its existence. But if something suddenly appears, right, we ask, well, where did it come from? How did it get here? This is one of the fundamental principles of science, that things that have beginnings have causes. Effects have causes. Things don't happen without a cause. Things don't pop into existence by themselves. If they did, science would be impossible. So science depends on this first premise, that effects have causes, that everything that has a beginning has a cause. And in a sense, that's what science is. It's studying in particular for causes, natural causes. That's why it was called natural science. So what causes this? What makes something happen? That's a search for causes. And it's based on this premise that whatever has a beginning must have a cause. So we're going to spend the vast majority of our time tonight then on the second premise. And this is the statement that has been reinforced by scientific discoveries all throughout the last 100 years. And this is premise 2, the universe had a beginning. Now, to understand these scientific discoveries, we have to go back about 100 years and see that at that time, in the early 1900s, virtually all scientists thought that the universe was eternal. This was the standard majority position among scientists, that the universe was eternal. Now, atheists at the time, atheists in the early 1900s, knew that this supported their position of atheism. You might think, well, why? Why would that be the case? Why would atheists think that that would be helpful to them if the universe was eternal? Well, it's because atheists in the early 1900s, as atheists today, recognize that if the universe was eternal, it doesn't need a cause. This goes back to the first premise. Something that doesn't have a beginning doesn't need a cause. And if the universe didn't have a beginning, then it didn't need a cause, i.e., it didn't need God. They thought of the universe being eternal or without cause, without a beginning. And that did, and I would agree, if that was the case, then that would provide some evidence for atheism, if the universe was eternal. Now, why did they think that? Why was that the majority position among scientists in the early 1900s? Well, it mostly had to do with Newtonian physics, right? We all study Isaac Newton in school, middle school, high school. And in the early 1900s, people still had a Newtonian understanding of how the universe worked, Newtonian physics. And according to Newtonian physics, space and time were static, and they went on forever. So you can almost think of it, according to Newton's theory, space and time made up like a stage or the background in which matter danced. So space and time were like the background stage, and then matter is what moved around on that stage. But the stage was fixed. Space and time was fixed. According to Newtonian physics, space is a three-dimensional volume that goes infinitely in every direction. And that's common sense. I mean, that's kind of intuitive. That's how we think of things. Even today, I think that's our intuition. That's how I normally think of space. And according to Newtonian physics, time is one-dimensional, and it goes infinitely both to the past and to the future. So that's, according to Newton's physics, and that's how people thought in the early 1900s. The problem was, and as we'll see tonight, all sorts of scientific discoveries came in during the 1900s which prove this wrong. So this has been completely blown out of the water, proven incorrect. Newton was, in fact, wrong on these things. And we're going to look specifically at the discoveries which prove that the universe had a beginning. And the story begins, like much of the 20th century science, this particular story starts with Albert Einstein and his theory of general relativity. He published this in 1915, the beginning of the century, and his original equations that were published indicated that the universe, not the ones that were published, his original equations that he did in his own studies indicated that the universe was expanding. In other words, indicated that the universe had a beginning. But remember, everybody at the time, including Einstein, thought that the universe was static and eternal. And so what he did is he put in a fudge factor into his equations so that they worked out to affirm a universe that was eternal and static, an unchanging universe, an eternal universe. He inserted this fudge factor to make his equations work out that way. And then that's what was published in 1915. Now, the first piece of evidence, we got to give credit where credit is due. The first piece of evidence that the universe wasn't static, was expanding, and therefore had a beginning, came when this gentleman, I'm probably not going to pronounce his name right, Vesto Slipher, possibly, Slipher. But he was the first to present evidence that the universe had a beginning. Now, he shared this evidence at the American Astronomical Society, and the evidence he shared was that all the galaxies he had studied, through his astronomy, the galaxies that he had studied were receding from Earth at fantastic speeds. So all the galaxies he looked at out in space were flying away from us, some of them up to 2 million miles an hour, flying away from the Earth. And so this was really the first piece of evidence that was presented. Now, Edwin Hubble, he's a very well-known, famous astronomer. He always has a pipe. We're going to look at several pictures, and whenever you see a gentleman with the pipe in his hand, most likely it's going to be Edwin Hubble. Now, Edwin Hubble confirmed these results through his looking at telescopes and his astronomy work. And he also discovered, not only did he confirm that these galaxies were flying away from us, but he discovered that the farther away a galaxy is from Earth, the faster that it's receding away from us. So this was very solid evidence that the universe is expanding. And I still have a hard time wrapping my mind around this because what they're getting at, what they're proposing, is that space itself is expanding. Now just, think about how that completely flies in the face of Newtonian physics, where space is static and unchanging. It's like a stage. According to this theory, what these scientific discoveries were indicating was that space itself was expanding, which blows my mind. It's even hard for me to comprehend. But all of this was indicating that the universe had a beginning, because think about it for just a second. If the universe is expanding, think of like maybe take a balloon and blow it up a little bit, and then draw some pictures on the balloon, and then blow the balloon up even more, and then the pictures itself get bigger, and then the pictures that you drew get bigger, and they expand away from each other. And that's a very simple two-dimensional example of what's going on three-dimensionally, according to this theory, that space itself is expanding. So if you can imagine that for just a moment, if you would go backwards in time then, everything would come together like a balloon coming together. In fact, the evidence seemed to indicate that it all came down to one singular point. If you would go backwards in history, everything's expanding forwards in history, but if you go backwards in history, everything came ultimately from nothing, is what was being proposed here. Now, one thing that helped them make these discoveries is known as the Doppler effect. You've probably heard of the Doppler effect, and it's something that you're very familiar with, even if you've never heard the term before. But you know how a car, when it's coming towards you, it makes a certain sound, more of a high-pitched sound, and then as the car passes you and starts going away from you, it makes a different sound, a lower-pitched sound. Now, the reason it does that is because of the motion of the car. If the car was like this one, unmoving, just, let's say, sitting there in the parking lot, and there were people standing around it, the noise of the car would sound the same to everybody. As you can see, the sound waves are going out, and they're the same waves that are hitting everybody's ears, and so it would sound the same to everybody if the car was unmoving. But if the car is traveling, you can kind of see what happens from this picture. Those that are standing in front of the car, as the car is moving, it's pushing, if you will, those sound waves together, shortening the waves, making them higher pitched. So you hear a car coming towards you, the sound waves get pushed together as the car is traveling towards you, pushes the waves, has a higher pitch, shorter waves. But as the car passes you and goes off in the other direction, the car making the noise is traveling away from you, and so that it elongates the waves. And that's why it sounds lower pitched. And this is just known as the Doppler effect. This has been known for quite a while. But this Doppler effect also happens with light, because light is also a wave. So, astronomers know that when they look at something that is moving towards you, right, it's pushing the waves, so to speak, shortening the waves, and so it shifts them more to the violet end, the purple end of the light spectrum. But when something is moving away from you, it shifts slightly to the red end of the light spectrum. It's called the red shift, because when the light waves get elongated, it shifts more to the red end of the light spectrum, the red shift. And so this is one way that they can measure how fast that these galaxies are moving away from us, by how much they've shifted when we look at them on the light spectrum, using the Doppler effect. Now I want to introduce you to the next stage in this story. The next chapter in this story was two men, independently, discovered solutions to Einstein's equations which described this expanding universe. So remember, kind of what we've seen here in the early 1900s. Einstein, brilliant man, comes up with these equations to describe the universe. They indicate that the universe is expanding, therefore had a beginning. He knows that can't be right, so he puts a fudge factor in there. But now some empirical observations are saying that the universe actually is expanding. It really does have a beginning. And so two men, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre possibly, both independently solve Einstein's equations such that they work out to describe an expanding universe, a universe with a beginning. Now I want to focus on the second gentleman, Lemaitre. He was a physics professor and a Catholic priest. Now the reason I want to focus on him is that he's the one who made this connection between his solution to Einstein's equations that result in expanding universe and Hubble's observations, this red shift that the universe, the galaxies are receding away from us. He made the connection between these two things and was the first one to propose the Big Bang theory. Now I know a lot of Christians sometimes might gravitate away from that phrase or be intimidated by that phrase, but they shouldn't. Because really all that's being communicated by the Big Bang theory is that the universe had a beginning. The universe really exploded, if you will, into existence from nothingness. That's all that's being communicated in the Big Bang theory. And so Christians shouldn't be intimidated or they shouldn't shun away from either the phrase, the Big Bang, or the theory itself. It actually affirms what they believe, that the universe was created. So Einstein was very opposed. This is the two gentlemen. This is George and Einstein. And Einstein was very opposed to this conclusion. Remember, everybody thought the universe was eternal. And he even Einstein published a paper against this, arguing that it was wrong. However, Einstein kept studying the issue. He kept looking into it. And in 1929, Einstein, remember who that is with the pipe in his hand? That's Edwin Hubble, with his telescope. In 1929, Einstein went and looked at the empirical evidence himself with Edwin Hubble, this red shift, the galaxies flying away from us. And he admitted he was wrong. In fact, Einstein said this was the biggest blunder of his life, putting in those fudge factors to his equations. Because if he just would have trusted his original equations, he could have predicted the expanding universe. He could have predicted even that the universe had a beginning and the Big Bang theory. But instead it was others, because he just was convinced the universe was eternal until the evidence just was so compelling he admitted he was wrong. So some scientists, including Einstein and others, early in the 1920s, 1930s then, came to this conclusion that the universe had a beginning, but the vast majority of scientists rejected this. And they were very hesitant to accept this idea that the universe had a beginning. They resisted the evidence for a long, long time. In fact, in 1959, so what are we talking, 30 years later, there was a survey done of leading American astronomers and physicists, and according to that survey, 2/3 of them in 1959 still believed in an eternal universe. So even though this evidence was fairly compelling, people resisted the idea. And you might ask why? Why were they so resistant? Well, here's a few quotes. The first one is from a famous English astronomer, Arthur Eddington. And he wrote, "The notion of a beginning is repugnant to me." I thought scientists are supposed to be perfectly objective. says, no, it's repugnant. I simply do not believe that the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe is preposterous, incredible. It leaves me cold. The idea of a bang, the idea of an explosion, that's kind of a bad, negative, derogatory connotation. When people propose the theory of the Big Bang, it probably wasn't the best words, because it does kind of indicate chaos. I mean, an explosion, a bang, think of a firecracker, dynamite, a grenade, causes mass chaos. But that's not what we see in the universe. We see, in fact, what we'll look at, some very incredible precision and order that came from the Big Bang. So the Big Bang, unfortunately, is just a term that started and it stuck, but it might not be the best term to describe what happened when the universe came into existence. Another quote from a German physicist, Walter Nernst, who also resisted the evidence, resisted this idea that the universe had a beginning. He said, to deny the infinite duration of time would be to betray the very foundations of science. This is how much Newtonian physics played a critical foundation in people's scientific understandings, that they just would not easily give it up. One of the reasons that people had such a hard time accepting that the universe had a beginning is because they recognize that something that has a beginning needs a cause. And if the universe had a beginning, then we have to start thinking about, okay, well, what caused the universe? Now, I'm not saying everybody rejected this theory because of that, but it seems like some wrestled with it. And we'll see some more quotes from folks who wrestle with it because it has these sort of theistic implications to it. So even though by 1959, 2/3 of scientists, leading astronomers and physicists, still believed in an eternal universe, more and more evidence just kept pouring in throughout the 20th century to prove that the universe had a beginning. And we're going to look at just two more pieces of that evidence and how this story developed. So the next piece of evidence that came in was in 1965, and this is a fascinating story. There were two scientists at Bell Labs, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, and what they were doing, they were trying to use a detector that was designed for satellite communications. So they weren't even necessarily investigating, cosmology or anything in space. They were doing this work with satellite communications. However, no matter where they pointed their equipment, they always kept getting this strange radiation noise in the background, in their signal. And they tried to get rid of it. They tried to do different things so that this noise wouldn't keep showing up. In fact, at one point they thought maybe it was bird droppings that was out there on their equipment. And so they had somebody, I'm sure, clean that stuff off, but they still picked up this background radiation. Long story short, what they had actually discovered was the background afterglow radiation from the Big Bang. So by accident, they discovered what had been predicted by some people who believed that the universe had a beginning, believed in the Big Bang theory, but they had actually found it and detected this background radiation from the beginning of the universe, and this led to them winning the Nobel Prize. The last piece of evidence comes just fairly recently, 30 years ago, 1992. This gentleman, George Smoot. Now, what he discovered was slight variations in the temperature of this background radiation. So it's the same background radiation that we were talking about, but he discovered slight variations within this background afterglow radiation from the Big Bang. Now, it's difficult to understand if you're not a scientist, and I read and try to understand, do my best, but basically, as best as I can understand it, these background variations, these slight variations, had to be set just right, or the universe would not have expanded the way that it did. In other words, let me say it this way. If this expansion rate of the universe wasn't just perfect, then matter would not have been able to congregate together to make our galaxies, stars, and eventually planets. The slightest difference either way, if this expansion rate was just slightly different either direction, then galaxies never would have formed. So if it had to be great enough for matter to congregate, but not too great, or the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. So these background variations in the temperature, the expansion rate of the universe had to be set just right. So here, kind of a preview for next week, was evidence of design in the Big Bang, evidence of precision, evidence that things had to be set just right so that chaos didn't result. That's why the Big Bang kind of gives you this connotation of chaos, but in fact it was more like a very quick order that was put into place in the universe. Very quick, like sometimes you watch those videos of people building Lego sets at a very high speed, and it seems like somebody just builds a big Lego castle in like 30 seconds. And it's that type of order, that sort of precision that's coming together very rapidly at the beginning of the universe. So not chaos at all, not like an explosion in the Legos that just sends them everywhere, but like an order that's being built very quickly at the beginning of the universe. Now these discoveries, and his work is very well known for these infrared pictures that they took, which point to matter that existed in the very, very, very early universe. Matter that would eventually form into galaxies. So this picture isn't one of those infrared pictures. This picture is actually a picture of our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy. But these infrared pictures that they took of this very early matter, some have called that early matter galaxy seeds. And so this is a huge scientific discovery. Smoot himself, the scientist who discovered them, called these galaxy seeds, this early matter from the beginning of the universe, he called them the fingerprints of the Maker, fingerprints of our Maker. He also won the Nobel Prize for this. Stephen Hawking, one of the most famous scientists in the world, Einstein, like, you know, Newton, Einstein, Stephen Hawking is kind of in that category. Hawking said this was, Smoot's discovery was the most important discovery of the 20th century, if not of all time. So all of this evidence through the 20th century just was overwhelming that the universe had a beginning. And because there's just so much evidence, virtually all scientists now agree that the universe had a beginning. Here's Stephen Hawking again. He wrote, almost everyone now believes the universe, time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. So this is a complete reversal from the early 1900s. Another well-known astronomer, cosmologist, Alexander Vilenkin, he wrote, with the proof now in place, cosmologists, astronomers, those who study these things, the universe, they can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. The evidence is just too overwhelming. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, it's very interesting why he would choose that term, problem. Why is it a problem for the universe to have a beginning? Not only is it because, this is a complete reversal from Newtonian physics and from virtually everybody's position 100 years ago. Not only is it problematic because it changed everybody's mind, but it's a problem, if you will, because of the first premise of our argument. Something that has a beginning must have a cause. And if the universe had a beginning, everybody understands the implications of this, then the universe must have a cause. Now you might have noticed, maybe even from the beginning of this lecture, you might have noticed that the argument doesn't end with the existence of God. All it does is end with a cause, right? So how then could this be an argument for God? It seems like an argument that the universe had a cause, not an argument for God. Some people, when they see this argument, they push back and say, well, there could be all sorts of possibilities for what this cause could be like. It could be all sorts of things. Why think that it's God? Well, I'm going to take the next step in this argument and show why or how we can make the connection to the existence of God from this first cause argument. And to do that, I'm going to use something that's usually referred to as abductive reasoning. Now, you're very familiar with abductive reasoning. In fact, you use it every day. Scientists use it every day. It's a very common approach to reasoning. You're probably used or familiar with the terms deductive and inductive reasoning. But abductive is also a very valid way of reasoning, and I'll give you an example of it here. So the argument we started out with is the deductive argument, right? So you're probably used to deductive arguments. You've got premises and that lead to a conclusion, right? That's a deductive argument or deductive reasoning. Premises flow to a conclusion. Now the premises in a deductive argument are usually based on inductive reasoning, empirical observations, right? And that was the case with our deductive argument. The universe had a beginning. That's an empirical observation the scientists have made over the last 100 years, and we studied that tonight. The first premise is empirical observation, right? We've just never seen something that has a beginning that doesn't have a cause. We've just never observed. It's an empirical observation. So deductive arguments usually start with induction, right, empirical observation to build a premise, and then use logic to draw conclusions, and that's the deductive aspect of it. So abductive reasoning is a little bit different. Abductive reasoning uses criteria, things like plausibility, scope, reasonableness, to narrow down from all the possible explanations down to the best one. So it's a process of looking at the data and asking what's the best explanation that explains the data. That's abductive reasoning. And like I said, we do this all the time in our daily lives and in science. Sometimes it's called an inference to the best explanation. An inference to the best explanation of all the relevant data or all the relevant phenomena that we're taking a look at. So let me just give you a silly example, but this will be one that you'll be able to remember just because it is so silly, but it illustrates how abductive reasoning works. Let's say, I'm giving this lecture here tonight and we hear a knock on the door. We hear, let's say, 3 knocks at the door right in the middle of my lecture. And we could ask, what is the best explanation of that noise? Now, there's an infinite amount of possibilities, right? I mean, we can just imagine all sorts of wacky, weird possibilities of what caused that knock on the door. In fact, we could brainstorm here and just be silly for a moment. Somebody could say, well, one possibility is that somebody down at the zoo had trained a giraffe to knock on doors for food. And that's not unreasonable, right? People train animals to do that. But this zookeeper has brought a giraffe to our door and had them knock on the door, and that's what caused the knocking noise. It's possible, right? But is that the best explanation? Is that the most reasonable, most plausible explanation? Probably not. As you can imagine, there's an infinite amount of possible explanations for this. But if we looked at the data and we, talked here in the room about, different possible explanations, and somebody said, well, Mike was going to be here at about this time, and I see his car out the window. So now we have a little bit more data, and we can say, well, it's still possible it's the giraffe. It's possible. But what's the most plausible? What best fits the data? And, inference to the best explanation is that it's Mike. It's Mike at the door. Now, it could be my neighbor. It could be my parents coming to visit. There are other possible explanations, but the most reasonable and most plausible one is that it's Mike. That's how abductive reasoning works. So if we go back to the argument then, this first cause argument, we can use abductive reasoning to infer that this first cause, this cause of the universe, is supernatural. You may say, well, that's a big leap. How could we infer that? Well, think about it for a moment. What is nature? I mean, most of the time we just use the word nature to refer to, like with naturalism. A belief in naturalism is the belief that all that exists is the physical universe, the physical material universe. So nature just is the universe. Nature is space, time, and matter. That's what the universe is, right? Space, time, and matter. But all of those things began at the beginning of the universe. The universe began at a certain point. And so this cause has to be above nature, above or beyond space, time, and matter. And that's really all that the word supernatural means. Super, above, beyond nature. So it seems plausible, it seems very reasonable that this first cause is beyond nature, beyond the universe, because space, time, and matter began when the universe began, because that's what the universe is, space, time, and matter. In fact, going back to Arthur Eddington, one of the ones that was struggling with this idea that the universe had a beginning, he said, "The beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look on it as frankly supernatural." And this was one of the reasons why he resisted it, and others, because it has this inference or implication to it. This also leads us to conclude that this first cause must be then outside space, time, and matter. If all those things had their beginnings in the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe, then this cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, because it was the cause of space, time, and matter. It caused those things to come into existence. So we would understand this cause then to be outside of space, time, and matter, spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Clearly, I think it's reasonable to conclude that this cause had to be incredibly powerful to create the entire universe, which we can't even measure. It's so big. We can measure how far we can see with our most powerful telescopes. We still don't have any idea how big the actual universe is. So whatever caused it had to be incredibly powerful to create it out of nothing. I think sometimes it's hard for us to get our mind around nothingness. We think of nothing as maybe, space out there. Like if we fly out to space, there's nothing out there. Actually, there is something out there. There's space, right? And there's matter. There's planets and stars and galaxies, right? There is stuff out there. Space, matter. But before space, time, and matter, there was absolute nothingness. That's why the Big Bang theory is so provocative, is that it says that the universe came out of not empty space, it came out of nothingness. Space came out of nothingness. So this cause had to be incredibly powerful. And then I think it's reasonable to infer that this cause had to be extremely intelligent. And we just saw one piece of this. We're going to see more next week. But one of the things that would lead us to this conclusion is that there seems to be design, there seems to be precision at the beginning, not only at the beginning of the universe, but as we'll see next week, within the universe there seems to be design and precision and specified complexity. And again, this is an inductive observation. We've never seen design from anything other than intelligence, a mind. That's the only thing that we've ever seen design come from. That's just an empirical observation. We've never observed design come from anything else but from a mind, an intelligent mind. So it seems reasonable to conclude then that this cause must be intelligent, some sort of an intelligent mind, at least analogous to ours. And this list then, these abductive inferences of this first cause, this description I've got up on the screen now is pretty much how theists think of God. And the cultures that we've talked about, the different people groups throughout history, people like Aristotle and others have come to this conclusion that God is like this because of these type of cosmological arguments. This isn't a coincidence. People think of God this way because they've reached the same conclusion through inference, the way that we have tonight, by looking at this evidence that this cause must be beyond space and time, intelligent, and incredibly powerful. And this is just how most theists understand God. Now, the last thing we need to do tonight is ask the question that always comes up at this point, and that is, well, then what caused God? If everything has a cause, then what caused God? And you might remember that's not exactly what the first premise said. Remember the argument carefully. The argument isn't that everything has a cause. The argument, premise one of the argument, is that everything that has a beginning has a cause. And we're proposing that this supreme being, this cause, this uncaused cause, or according to Aristotle, this unmoved mover, the supreme being doesn't have a beginning. Therefore, it doesn't need a cause. It is eternal. Just like Aristotle said, to avoid an infinite regress, there has to be something that doesn't have a beginning. There has to be something that's eternal. There has to be an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover. And scientists know this. Right? That's why they had such a hard time, many of them, giving up the idea of an eternal universe. There has to be something that doesn't need a cause to stop this infinite regress. And they knew that if the universe didn't have a beginning, then it didn't need a cause. And what we're claiming at this point is that God doesn't have a beginning. So God doesn't need a cause. If we're okay with the idea of an eternal universe that doesn't need a cause, why are we not okay with the idea of a supreme being that doesn't need a cause? I think on the surface, that idea at least can't be rejected merely as an absurdity, an idea of a being without a cause, because that's how we, i.e. scientists, thought of the universe for so long, that it was eternal and didn't need a cause. So the idea that something can be eternal and therefore doesn't need a cause is not absurd on the surface, and that's just what we're proposing of this supreme being, that it is eternal and therefore doesn't need a cause. I want to show you a video, 4 or 5 minutes, and it's a great video put together by William Lane Craig's ministry, Reasonable Faith, and it's just a good summary of this argument. I find it to be very useful just to kind of wrap everything together and summarize what we've talked about in just a few minutes, and has some great animation. And it's a good video to share like on social media and spark some conversation, get some conversation going with your friends, family, those who might disagree with your belief in the existence of God. So let me show it to you now, and then we'll put a link below on the YouTube video so you can easily watch it Might be hard to watch it through this video, but you can access it directly through the YouTube link that we'll put down below.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin? Or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, three leading cosmologists, Alvin Bohr, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the syllabus and the class schedule real quick. And this is only going to apply for those that are taking this class here in Nebraska, or anybody taking it through Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Spurgeon College. So if you're just auditing the class, or if you're taking the class in Germany, then none of this will apply to you. But if you take a look at the class schedule, I just want to inform you what's due. Make sure we're all on the same page just with class logistics. But take a look at the class schedule. Tonight is February 4th. We studied the first cause argument, and you guys have several chapters you had to read for tonight. Therefore, your reading summaries are due by midnight tonight. So make sure, write a small paragraph per chapter, but no longer than 1 page total for the whole thing. And make sure you email that to me by midnight tonight. It's due, February 4th. At the top of the class schedule, I have some specific instructions for how to email that to me, what to put in the subject line, how to name your document so I can organize things well. But let's take a look for next week then. Next Thursday night we'll come back together. That's February 11th. And we'll take a look at the design argument. You've got, it looks like, 1 chapter to read in Frank Turek and Norman Geisler's book, chapter 3. 3 chapters to read in Thinking About God, chapters 7, 8, and 9. And then 1 chapter in the book, Love Your God with All Your Mind, chapter 7. So read all. I know it's a lot of reading here early in the semester. And then do your reading summaries for that. And then those will be due next Thursday by midnight, February 11th. And on that night, I'll give a lecture on the design argument. If you have any questions about the material, the class content, or just the logistics, dates, and homework, things that are due, please email me and let me know how I can help. We will do one other thing tonight. We're having to quarantine with our family this week, so people couldn't come over for the lecture live tonight, so everybody's going to have to watch it online, unfortunately. And so what we'll do is, since we're not able to bring people together for a debate and read our reading summaries to each other and discuss our readings, what I'm going to do is go back and cover the material that I couldn't cover last week, that I ran out of time with, and that is objections to apologetics. So we'll take a brief break and then I'll come back and cover objections to apologetics.